Hello once again and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor series. So as the title suggests, I am going to show you how to paint this cute Labrador puppy with a Santa's cap on. For those who would like to download this simple sketch of the puppy, link is in the description below. I am using Canson cold press watercolor paper 300 grams per square meter, and the size of this painting is A5. To kickstart, I am just showing you my color mixing process to arrive at a cool grey mix by adding burnt sienna to a sapphire blue. You can also use ultramarine blue. Mix these two colors and you'll arrive at this grey tone, as I'm showing you a sample of how it looks like on a paper. And the second color is yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of sapphire or burnt umber, as well as a little hint of burnt sienna. So the combination of these three colors will give you a dull looking yellow, which is similar to the fur color of Labrador. And I'm going to paint this puppy's portrait using the wet on wet technique. So as you can see here, I am pre-wetting the puppy sketch, and keep re-wetting your paper until it's totally wet, because sometimes we need to re-wet it a few times in order to achieve a good wet on wet painting. And first color that I'm going to drop in is the grey mix, and I'm going to kick start by painting the center cap where the white border or the white fur is. After applying the color, next you will need to use a clean damp brush to blend in those colors. Why I'm doing this is because this is a wet on wet painting. As you witness, the color started spreading in quickly onto the wet surface. So by using a damp brush, you have more control of the color blending process, as well as lifting out pigments wherever necessary. Next, I am going to drop in that yellow ochre mix onto the puppy's face sketch or portrait. As you can see, I am painting wherever I notice has more of the yellow ochre tone, and leaving out some empty spaces where I notice have a brighter shade or lesser pigment. And as I mentioned earlier, you can keep re-wetting all those areas that have dried up, because if it's no longer wet, then it will be difficult to nail a good wet on wet technique. Just ensure you don't re-wet areas that have already been painted, as the excess water could result in marks, unwanted marks like cauliflower marks onto the painted areas. And once again, I am using the damp brush method that I used earlier for the Santa cap, and just blending in those yellow ochre pigments that I applied onto the wet surface. I have decided to paint the Santa cap, which is the red part of the Santa Claus cap, and I'm also using the wet on wet technique. So you can see me pre-wetting those areas. I'm just going to use some carmine, permanent carmine, to paint this. So I am just applying basic washes of the permanent carmine onto the pre-wet area of the Santa hat. And at a later stage of the painting, I will come back to redefine the shape of this hat. I have also extended the permanent carmine pigment onto the tongue of the Labrador. You can use magenta as well as an alternative. For the Labrador's facial features, I have decided to use some sapphire. You can also use burnt umber to paint the eyes and nose. And before I start painting with the pigment, I am just pre-wetting the area around the Labrador's nose, since the Sophia appears to be around its mouth and nose area. So in order to achieve that color spread, I have pre-wet before I drop in those paint. And as you can see here, after dropping in the pigment, I'm just using the damp brush to give it some washes or blend in lightly those colors. And as for the eyes, I'm just using the wet on dry painting technique, which means I have not pre-wet the painting area, because I would like to maintain the sharp look of its eye on this painting. I have also extended the Sophia pigment onto the jawline as well as its paws. Now it's time to paint the ball part of the center head or the pom-pom. I'm going to use the same gray mix that I used for the border part of the head. So I'm just pre-wetting the pom-pom sketch before I drop in those gray shade. So before I move to more fine-tuned details of the painting, I've decided to paint the background. Once again, using the wet on wet technique, so I am pre-wetting the background area, avoiding the dog painting. So make sure you don't accidentally wet the dog's painting to avoid any miserable accidents when you drop in those pigments. If you would like to attempt to paint this using the wet on dry technique, then go ahead. I'm using a blue shade for the background. You can use any color of your choice. Some water sprinkle using my water spray if you want extra effects. So the background painting is completely dry, and just showing you all those water sprinkle effects created onto the wet painting. Can experiment these kind of effects to add more life to your watercolor painting. So time to fine-tune the painting of the Labrador, and in order to do this, I have mixed a combination of Sapphire, you can use burnt umber as I mentioned earlier, with a little bit of burnt sienna, and you will arrive at a deep brown shade. And I personally feel this shade actually complements the earlier yellow ochre shade. And once again, I am going to paint this color using the wet on wet technique. So before I drop in those pigments, I am just pre-wetting the surface of the Labrador's painting using clean water, and you don't have to drag your brush on the first layer of painting too much. You just need to gently pre-wet the areas and then drop in those brown shade mix that I made earlier. So after I'm happy with the look of the pigment that I applied, I am once again using a clean damp brush to move those pigment or give it some blending so that it looks softer and more toned. So basically, as I do this, I need to keep in mind that I am highlighting some parts and darkening those dark areas as necessary. In other words, this step is focused on tonal values which defines the shape of this Labrador's face. So I am going to proceed using the same technique onto the other parts of the dog's body. You can start the blending process using the damp brush as soon as you apply the pigment, because if you wait too long, I am afraid the pigment applied onto the wet surface might dry up and then you might have difficulty in blending them. So do not wait too long in order to start the blending process, and it all falls back to your own observation how wet is the painting on your desk. Alright, it's time to fine tune the shape of the red hat as I mentioned earlier, and this time I have added in some bright red pigment onto the earlier permanent carmine that I had, and I'm just going to paint this wet on dry, as I need to define the dark areas by focusing on tonal values, and since the painting area is quite narrow, I don't foresee doing this in wet on wet technique. So as I paint, I am leaving in gaps, small gaps here and there, where I foresee highlights on the cap. Next, I am using a clean damp brush to soften those hard edges between the dark color and the gaps in order to achieve a softer look. Next, I am painting the eyes using a smaller size brush, and the color mix is indigo and black. If you would like to proceed by painting the eyes fully black, go ahead, but I don't prefer to do so because usually the eyes have some shine under natural light. In my opinion, it doesn't look extremely dark or black in color, which is why I decided to add indigo in the black mix. Okay, if you don't have indigo, you can mix in some darker blue shades as in ultramarine or sapphire blue shades. And I have also extended the same indigo and black paint mix onto the nose and the mouth area of the Labrador. After applying the paint, I'm just giving them some light washes using a clean damp brush. Also extending the color further towards the paws of the Labrador. A little bit of magenta to fine tune the tongue areas. So I'm applying the paint onto the dry painting, and then I'm going to give it some light washes with a clean damp brush to soften its look. Next, more fine details using the Saphia mix, and I'm using the smaller brush to paint in the paw areas. Some light washes using a clean damp brush to soften its look. And I'm going to paint this particular paw using the same Saphia mix, since it is behind the other two legs, so it appears to be in a darker value. Same thing to the fold areas of the puppy's legs and lower body, so I'm just darkening those areas, as well as other areas that I could notice is under the shade or has some shadow effect, so that the contrast will give it a more realistic look. Repainting the nasal area of the Labrador as it looks faded, so I need to intensify the features on its nose. Alright, time to apply some shadow effect, and I'm using the same grey mix that I made earlier in this tutorial, just painting that mix of paint using the wet on dry technique. So I have not pre-wet the paper surface, but right away painting it onto the dry painting. So if you're happy with the look of your puppy painting at this stage, then you can stop, but I would like to go an extra mile, as I always do in all my tutorial videos, and add more fluffiness to the look of this Labrador puppy. And in order to do that, I'm going to make the third layer of painting, and once again I'm going to use the wet on wet approach. So I'm pre-wetting the painting with clean water, and after that I am going to use white gouache paint. As you can see here, I am using a rigger brush because I just want to add a minimal touch of the white gouache paint onto the wet surface of the painting. So if you apply the white gouache paint onto the dry painting, I'm afraid it might look too harsh, whereby it will leave some hard lines of the white brush paint strokes. So which is why I decided to use the wet on wet technique, so that the gouache will bleed onto the pre-wet areas easily, and I can also use the damp brush to blend in further and add on to this entire fluffiness effect. You may also apply the white gouache paint as a highlight, especially onto the cornea and nose areas. You can apply the wet paint onto the edge of the sketch and then use a clean damp brush to make it bleed further onto the background painting. And that appears to look like its fur spiking out of the body, indirectly creating the fluffy look. A little bit of that fluffy effect onto the pom-pom as well. Some paint spatters using the same white gouache, and I'm using fan brush. You can use an old toothbrush to achieve the snow look, snowflakes look. After all, this is Christmas theme painting, right? So you can't miss the snow effect. Ta-da! There you go, a cute fluffy Labrador puppy with the Santa hat. How do you like it? So if you liked this video, then do like and share, and if you have become a fan of my work, then don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Hope to see you again in another tutorial. Bye.